Welcome learners. Now in this section we would be discussing how to measure the strengths and weaknesses of an NGO. You've already studied the SWOT analysis, and this is the unit 6 of block 2 in the course, the digital course we have, or the self-learning material we have, and this is a part of that unit, that is the SWOT. And SWOT you have already studied. You have understood different aspects of threat matrix, the opportunity matrix. Now we will discuss how to measure the strengths and weaknesses. Though when we talk about these two words, the strengths and the weaknesses, these two words are quite abstract in nature, and it is very difficult to understand or estimate that how do we measure these strengths and weaknesses. Now in certain cases, like for example, I'll give you an example of an individual. Say now individual is strong. Now how do you assess that the individual is strong, or how do you assess that the individual is weak? Do you assess with the physical strength or the weakness that portrays his or her personality, or the inner strength or weakness that portrays his or her personality? So in this case we have internal strengths and weaknesses as well as external strengths and weaknesses when we talk about the individuals. So now there are certain features, certain characteristics, certain parameters through which we can try to measure the strengths and weaknesses both in qualitative terms as well as in quantitative terms. Now we need to understand that when we talk about an NGO, why do we need to measure the strengths and weaknesses of that NGO or any organization? Usually this concept is used in the corporate world because the businesses are going through a lot of turmoil in the present times in the competitive environment. So that is why we require to measure the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. Similar thing applies for NGOs also. Now we need to understand that what are the parameters through which we can measure these strengths and weaknesses. And apart from that, in the next section we can even see the alternative ways to measure these strengths and weaknesses. So first we will try to assess the strengths and weaknesses. Now in this case, strengths and weaknesses, they vary. They can exist in varying degrees. Now for example, I was giving an example of an individual. Say individual X. Now he or she is very strong. What do you mean by very strong? He or she is not so strong. He or she is somewhat strong. He or she is not at all strong. Now these are the degrees through which we try to assess the strengths and weaknesses. Similar thing applies to the organization also. So for example, in an NGO, anybody, me, you, anybody. So some view the NGO to be very strong and some consider the NGO not to be so strong. Why do we say it so? So we need to find out the parameters or the features or the techniques to assess why we say that the NGO is very strong and NGO is not so strong. So we will discuss the three major techniques which are used worldwide to discuss how to judge or how to assess the degree of the strengths and weaknesses. Now these three techniques are very important, and these techniques have been popular throughout the world in the business organizations, and they have been applied in the business organizations or to the corporate world to measure the strengths and weaknesses. Now the first one is the attribute measures. The second one is the effectiveness measures, and the third one is the efficiency measures. Now these are the three techniques which we will be discussing about. Then at the last part, in the last part, we will be discussing the grid. And we will try to apply these techniques there, and we will try to find out whether a measurement can be done regarding these strengths and weaknesses. Now, starting with the attribute measures. When we talk about the attribute measures, attribute word is very popular in human resources, and we have been using a number of times that this person has such attribute, this organization has such attribute, this particular individual has leadership attribute, has say a special kind of personality which gives a special attribute. And so we just talk about the word attribute a lot. Now, what does attribute means? Now, attribute actually identifies a list of characteristics or quality which an NGO possesses or is expected to possess in future. So these are the ranges, the measures through which we can decide what the NGO does and how the strengths and weaknesses can be measured. Now, suppose if we try to measure the strength of an NGO through an attribute, the example would be our key strength is the high morale of the workers. Now, that high morale is a very abstract thing. How do you measure it? So it's qualitative in nature. That means the workers are quite motivated themselves to work for the organization, to work for the society, and therefore the strength lies in the employees of the organization. So for NGOs, this particular thing is very important, and because the employees are the inherent source of the performance of an organization, and if the employees have the high motivation level, they have high morale, the NGO is termed to be strong. But you see, this is qualitative in nature. Now, if we talk about the weakness, another example would be our biggest weakness is the lack of centralization of the control systems. That means it is decentralized. The NGO thinks this way. The NGO or any organization thinks this way, that the organization is not having a centralized system of working and the control is not there because there are different divisions or different sections in the organization itself which deal with themselves, and the information does not percolate to a particular center. So that may be a weakness, but in certain cases, in many organizations, decentralization becomes the strength also. So it depends on how the organization tries to behave or the organization tries to perform. So such statements, they reflect the presence of a characteristics without attaching a unit of measurement. So in this case, it is a measure. Attributes or the quality or the characteristics, they are the measure of the strengths and weaknesses of any organization, but they do not attach a unit of measurement. There is no quantitative term attached to these measures. So this is what is attribute measures. Now coming to the other part. So what do we mean by it? That means that to what extent the strength is actually contributing for competitive advantage is not known. We talk about that it is not attached with any unit of measurement. That means in numbers, we do not know that to what extent the strength is contributing to the competitive advantage or the performance of the organization. In numbers like high morale. High morale is a degree. It does not attach a number to it. That means high means like high. You cannot quantify it. It does not say 50 units. It is just high. So you do not know what is the extent of that high morale which is contributing for the competitive advantage. So it might be a strength for strength's sake with no substantial purpose. This is one of the drawbacks. This is one of the limitation of this attribute measures, where the strength may be for the strength's sake, just to show that high morale is there, but it may not have a substantial impact on the performance of the organization. So this is one of the limitations. Therefore, leaving the analysis only to the attributes statement, the level may be incomplete or inadequate. So attribute can be one measure of the strengths and weaknesses, but it cannot alone be the measure of strengths and weaknesses. So in certain cases it may be the only way to express one's strengths or weaknesses, and there are rare cases only, but then you have to attach other parts also to measure the strengths and weaknesses, because it decides the performance of the organization, and it decides also, if the performance is not good, then the NGO may not exist for a substantial period of time. So therefore the measurement techniques have to be used in such a way or in combination so that the organization performs well enough to sustain in a competitive environment. That is why we talked about that whether the strength is actually measuring the competitive advantage or not. But in this case it is not, but we can know the degree of the measurement. Now coming to the second technique. Now the second technique is effectiveness measures. Again, effectiveness is the degree. In this approach, the characteristic is represented by a statement which identifies the capability of the NGO or any organization for that matter. Since we are discussing the NGO part, we are concentrating only on the NGOs. So it decides the capabilities. What are the qualities the NGOs possess? Are they able to sustain in a competitive environment? Are they able to sustain in a crisis situation? Are they able to perform in the adverse conditions? So these are the capabilities of the organization, and this helps in the accomplishment of a particular or specific task or an objective. Because when we talk about strategic management, all the organizations, they have a goal, they have an objective, and they have to reach to a particular objective, and they have to accomplish a particular task or a goal. For example, let us take an example of the strength, which describes the effectiveness of an organization, which tries to measure the effectiveness of an organization. Now, the example can be in any ways. Our organization exercises for fitness plan, which has helped maintaining the high energy levels of our employees or managers, who are now able to devote one more additional hour of work each day. Now, one more additional hour of work each day means more production, more productivity. Production in terms of quantity, I'm not talking about more productivity in giving back to the society. So like fitness plan or any kind of exercise plan, any kind, say yoga or having gyms inside, having the recreational activities inside the organization, they may give a better environment to the organization, and that becomes a strength because it increases the productivity of the organization. Now in this case also, if you see, we are talking about the fitness plans, we are talking about many things inside it. It is the environment, the internal environment of the organization, which is helping the employees or the managers to perform better. But can you measure it? Again, you cannot measure it in quantitative terms. A better environment inside the organization is increasing the productivity, fine. But the degree of productivity has increased. High energy levels. Again, there is a degree. A degree is attached. Again, the unit of measurement is not attached. Now, in this case also, the effectiveness may be a little blurry at times. It may be for the sake of showing off, but it depends a lot on the organization. Some serious working organizations, they do have this kind of environment which provides a better working environment for the employees. So this is effectiveness measures. Now if we talk about the statement which we just discussed, the statement is reflective in nature. It tries to reflect the organization's nature. It measures the effectiveness of the strength. But if we talk about the weakness, now weakness can be anything. Again, if you see in this case also, we will see the example. The location of an NGO requires more travel time to reach to the actual community, and hence it tries to dissuade other people to achieve their targets for field visits. Now in this case, if NGO is located in a place where the volunteers are not able to reach on time and volunteers are not able to perform better, so in this case the volunteers, the motivation level of volunteers is reduced to a lot of extent because the travel time is more and they are not able to reach to the organization on time. They are not able to perform their job because they have to go through the traffic and other distractive elements on the roads. So that may provide a kind of a situation where the organizations, they have less productivity. So that becomes a weaknesses. Though the location problem may be because of the formation of NGO, there may be certain other limitations and issues, but at particular point of time this becomes the weaknesses. So this is again the effectiveness measure. That means the effectiveness of the organization is lost because of the location. So these are the effectiveness measures. Now coming to the other part, the third technique, that is efficiency measures. Now how do we measure the efficiency? So the word efficiency means the productivity of an organization which converts the inputs into the desired outputs. For example, 10% reduction rates is a big loss to our production. Now that can be related to the material production or the manufacturing unit. In case of NGOs also this happens, like funding. If the NGOs, they have estimated that this much fund would be received in a particular point of time or in a particular span of time. So, and if that funding is not received, that percentage of funding is not received, that becomes the weakness of the organization due to any reason. There are a number of reasons, but in efficiency measures, if you see 10, the numeral is there. So we have attached a unit of measurement in this. So this hints at the poor quality control arrangements. So efficiency measure is implementable only in the quantifiable situations. So we have three techniques: the attribute technique, the effectiveness technique, and the efficiency technique. So out of these three, the attribute and effectiveness measures, they are not quantifiable. They are being measured in the qualitative terms. But when we talk about efficiency, they are quantifiable in nature. Now, there are different ways to measure the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and the 5 ways of looking at the strengths and weaknesses are. Now, in these cases, all these 5 ways, they can be applied to all 3 techniques. It depends on the organization how they apply these techniques. So when we talk about the 5 ways, the first is the assessment by managers. When we talked about in the first case the attributes, high morale. Now the manager has to assess how much high morale is there, whether the employees are motivated or not. So they have a record, they have a worksheet where they try to find out how much productive the employees are. So they can do the assessment. That is a feedback analysis kind of a thing. There's a monitoring thing, there's an evaluation mechanism for the employees through which you can assess that whether the employee is performing up to the mark or not. Then there is an equilibrium analysis. Equilibrium analysis is to balance the resources, the optimal utilization. This again is done inside the organization. When we discuss the analytical method, it assesses the key facts from which strengths and weaknesses can be determined. There are other measures of strengths and weaknesses like critical success factor concept, the core competency approach. Now, critical success factor concept, when we talk about this concept, in this concept, the measurement is done using certain key factors which the organization possesses. It is again related to the attribute measures, where the typical factors which are associated with the organization, which leads to the success of the organization. Say one was high morale, then we say networking can be a critical success factor for the NGO. Similarly, there are core competency approaches. Usually every organization tries to possess a competency, a special type of a skill which is not available with the other organization. So usually every NGO which works in and around the community, they have a core competency associated with themselves. So that is why it is very important for the NGOs to apply this approach also to measure the strengths and weaknesses. So when we talk about the ways to measure the strengths and weaknesses, there are certain uses of the measurements. Why do we require the measurement per se? Now, when we talk about the use of measurements, we always say that it is a function of the degree of specificity which is possible for a given element or characteristic. When attribute measurement is done, it is simply listing of the capabilities. Effectiveness measures, it relates to the abilities of the organization or the capabilities of the organization. Efficiency measure is concerned with the optimum conservation of organization's resources into desired outputs. So first two are qualitative in nature, and the last one is quantitative in nature. That is why we require the measurement techniques to be applied for the organization or an NGO. Now, what is the basis of measures an organization which tries to employ these bases? Why do they employ? What should be the basis of it? Why do the measurement is being required for the organization? So the type of measurement an organization would employ will be a function of the first one, the characteristics, which is in terms of strengths or weaknesses and which is being measured. And second one would be the level within the organization which is required to utilize the measurement sources. So this is the basis of measures an organization tries to employ. Now you see the basis of measures an organization employs. When we continue with it, there are situations where the organizations, they are dealing with softer variables. Softer variables in this case would be meaning milder variables like shared values, the managerial climate and culture, the depth of the managerial competence, there are human relationship skills, etc. So it may be difficult to use the effectiveness and efficiency measures in these cases. So in this case, we try to use the attribute measures, and because they define the particular quality of an organization. So these are certain bases through which the organization, they try to measure the strengths and weaknesses. That at lower levels, say the functional levels like marketing, finance, etc., we would be seeing the alternative measures also later on in later sessions. But there are functional levels like marketing, finance, operations, etc. The efficiency and effectiveness measures are very aptly used, and they are quite useful for the organizations. But at higher levels, which are concerned with the total organization and which are concerned with the strategic motives of the organization, or which are concerned with building the strategy for the organization, the attribute measure becomes more important, and of course the effective measures are also more viable. The attribute and effectiveness measures, they seem to be more important as the scope of internal analysis is broadened to meet the demands of higher management. So now when we just discuss, I'll just show you the grid approach. Now in grid approach, what you do is you try to frame the major functions on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have the attributes. So when we talk about the major functions and attributes, now for example, I am using a grid approach for any organization, say NGO. Now in attributes, we just describe the efficiency and effectiveness. Then in the second matrix, it is the stability. Then you have future development and directions, and then you have the functional areas like marketing, human resources, finance, manufacturing, systems, strategy, operations, etc. Now in this case, if we try to measure the efficiency and effectiveness, it can be average for marketing. Stability would be for average to good flexibility, that is the degree we are using. Then for future development directions, it can be average to good, and it can be needing the re-examinations. Similarly for human resources, it can be good for the present, it can be average, it needs improvement. Similarly for finance, it can be poor and needs topmost priority. Now this provides a kind of inherent sense that what basic points or the functional areas they require the improvement, and what areas they do not require much improvement but they need some kind of development process so that they can sustain the strength of the organization. So this is basically the grid approach which we discussed, and this is related to the major functions of the organization. Now we'll just stop here and then we'll move on to the next part, where we will be discussing the alternative approaches to measure the strengths and weaknesses. So when we summarize the whole approach, and you will find that the whole approach describes three basic techniques: the attribute measures, the effectiveness measures, and the efficiency measures. And we have just discussed that the attribute measure is basic. Attribute and efficiency measure is basically used at the top management level, and effectiveness and efficiency measures, they are used at the functional areas. And when we can apply the grid and try to formulate what exactly is the strength and weaknesses of the organization. Thank you so much.